What a whirlwind of a lecture this one was. So many plot frameworks. I'm Nicole, I'm a writer. I share my writing journey here on YouTube, and I am so excited to talk about Brandon Sanderson's plot lecture today, which was all about the different story frameworks. I'm going to frame our little recap discussion here into 3 sections. The first one is going to be for pantsers, the next one is for plotters, and the next one is just kind of odds and ends at the end. I will note that I have a ton of resources linked in the description box. Brandon gives a really good overview of a lot of these, and we kind of can talk about like the pros and cons and when to use. However, he didn't go into super in depth. That would have taken forever. So I linked a bunch of resources that I use or have used in the past that can take you deeper for these. So let's get straight into it. And we're going to start with the 4 Panthers ones, just because I feel like we always start with the hero's journey and I've had enough of it, but we'll still talk about it, you know. All right, the first one for Panthers that Brandon talks about is the yes, but, no, and, which is basically the idea that you're taking your story and you are showing a series of escalations. So the character, has a goal. Do they accomplish the goal or not? Yes, but they have to do this other thing as well. Or no, and it got harder. This is very, very useful for kind of events cascading together. It gives a great sense of progress. And it reminds you, I think, to remember that your character should always be working towards something, towards a goal, because otherwise, or towards figuring out a question. Because otherwise, if there's no goal, if there's no question, like what are they saying yes and no to, if that makes sense. Where this can kind of go wrong is it can go a little bit off the rails, and it's almost better for smaller bits of stories. Like I would even say sequences. So you know how a story can be broken up into acts, and those acts can be broken up into like sequences of scenes. So I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head here, but an example, I know the sequences in my own books, but an example would be like Harry Potter, right? There's all of Act 1, but there is the sequence of Vernon Dursley like bringing his family to the Rock, and then there's the sequence of Diagon Alley, and then we're on the train, we're getting settled at Hogwarts, we're, getting sorted. Like all of these are kind of little cascades with like almost mini goals, if that makes sense. In my own story, I have a sequence where there's it's a heist and they're trying to figure out, they're trying to crack a code in order to find something. And so there's a sequence where they're really trying to crack that code. There's another sequence where they're really trying to break into security. And it's like a couple of scenes together. And so that's very helpful, I think, within a sequence where you can say yes, but, no, and, so you can escalate it. And then at the end of the sequence, you have the biggest, like, yes, we accomplished our goal, but, and here's our new goal. So again, really good for connecting desire lines, goals, etc. It's also very similar to the Pixar structure, which is once upon a time, every day, but one day, because of that, because of that, because of that, until finally. I'll link an article about that below. I actually like yes, but, no, and better because I think it helps that, again, it goes back to the desire, but because of that, also helps you think of cause and effect. All about cause and effect there, very useful. The next thing we touch on is points on a map, which is a pantsing kind of idea of I know where I'm starting, I know where I'm ending, and I know I have to hit X, Y, Z in the middle. Literally, like the road trip metaphor he uses is pretty perfect. It's just a couple of bullet points. Start here, this happens, and then we get there. And I think this can be used very well as kind of an overarching idea, and you can use yes, but, no, and the try-fail kind of in the middle between your points in order to get from one to the other. So I think that's what I was trying to say with the sequences. So I'm starting here, I need to get to point X. I can have yes and no but all through the middle, or I can have a try-fail cycle and eventually I end up there. So what is a try-fail cycle? Basically, again, I love how these pantsing ones are so focused on the character's goals, which we know drives momentum in the story. Basically, it's the idea that your character is trying to do something and they kind of have 3 attempts at it. So the first one, they try the obvious solution and it fails. Very useful for getting rid of plot holes, like, because the audience can be very frustrated by like, well, why didn't you just do X? Then they try a more complex and creative approach, but it also fails, and then on attempt 3 they're successful. Whoopsies. On attempt 3 they're successful, but only after overcoming significant obstacles, and I would add there's usually a new complication that's introduced. So we've done this, but we're successful finally, but oh no. Or, we get to the Mirror of Erised, we get to where the stone is, but Voldemort's not there, Quirrell is, and it's that new surprising thing at the end. So those were the 3 he covered for Panthers, which I think are really useful, and also useful if you're trying to figure out kind of the middle of your outline. I think these are very helpful for, and we'll talk about 3-act structure in a second. Actually, let's talk about 3-act structure right now. So Brandon describes 3-act structure as more of an arrow going towards an explosive ending than a circle, like in the story Circle or in the hero's journey. It's more 4 acts actually instead of 3 acts, which I 100% agree with, and I've always used 4 acts because I'm like, what do you? It really is like, how is that 3? It's definitely 4. Anyways, basically in the first act, you're introducing the character need status quo. You have your arrow going towards a major dramatic question. You have an inciting incident that starts a cascade of events, not what brings you into act 2. And then you have 2 plot points, which is plot point 1, point of no return, and plot point 2 is kind of your all is lost. You can also have pinch points in there, which I don't think Brandon talked about, but they're the moments where the power of the antagonist is shown. This is well described in story engineering. And then you have a midpoint where there's a sort of big shift. And so it can be a shift in the character's motivations. I like the thinking of it's when the truth of the story, the nature of the true conflict is revealed. And Save the Cat is the kind of overarching one for that. But one of the issues with 3-act structure and with Save the Cat is Act 2. And I think we all look at it and are like, ooh, especially when we get to I find fun in games really, really hard, which is we've done plot point 1, we've passed the point of no return. We haven't discovered the true nature of the conflict. We haven't kind of gone into overdrive at our midpoint yet. It's just fun in games. The premise, the promise of the premise, they're just doing the story. How the hell what do you do with that? None of these story structures do a great job of giving you steps in Act 2, especially the fun in games. And so this is where I think, again, the try-fail cycles and the yes but no ands can really come in and help plotters. Even if you're just doing it in your outline, it's like, okay, in the fun and games, I'm gonna have them do, a try-fail cycle of 2 different goals, and the first goal is gonna get to the second problem. They're gonna do a try-fail cycle of the second problem, and then the second problem is gonna lead to the point where the midpoint. Something like that can really, really help, because then you have another structure to look at, and you can say, okay, they do the obvious thing. Okay, they do something creative and it fails. Okay, now they're gonna be successful. And you can really kind of work through it like that. All right, finally, let's talk about the hero's journey, the monomyth, which is the other kind of 4 plotter structure he mentions here. Basically, this lecture is something of a rant of Brandon Sanderson being like, this structure is too rigid and it can go off the rails. And I agree. I've never loved the hero's journey. The monomyth, first of all, there's so many steps, and you start talking about virgins and goddesses, and it just gets very, very but it is a well-known structure that we should know, and gonna be able to identify and have in our pocket. It's basically a person in a state of rest goes on a journey and then returns changed, right? So we have sort of our ordinary world, then there's a call to adventure. They refuse the call because they don't want their world to change. They meet with the mentor, they cross the threshold. Then they have the road of trials, which again is that first half of Act 2, fun and games, where they're just character is tested. And you're like, oh, that's so much information that I need in order to be able to write my story. Thank you for all that detail. But basically, the road of trials is next. The character is tested. They learn they lack the knowledge or skills they need to overcome their challenges. They kind of go through that. Eventually, they have a come to Jesus moment, or a direct confrontation with the evil inside of them or their parental figure. And because of that, they are transformed, paying some sort of price. So it really is an arc-based myth, and it does reflect kind of what our cycle is for learning. There is a lot of external force that are part of the monomyth, I think. So you have the meeting with the mentor, visit to the goddess, return with the elixir. So there's a lot of forces that are supposed to come in to influence the character, so they learn, and so they, improve and change and etc. Which makes sense to have these to think of those external forces coming in and also what the character is doing. But it is very rigid, and I will link a resource to the hero's journey below if you want to read through all of those steps. I've got the first act down. The rest of it, I get very confused because in my mind it kind of does contradict the save the cat 3-act structure thing. I find it hard to put them together because your bottom point of the circle, I feel like in most stories for the hero's journey, is not the midpoint, but it's more like what ends up being the 75% mark. I don't know. I've always found that very confusing. If anybody can has a resource where you put 3-act structure on top of hero's journey, that would be very useful. I would love that. All right. And so then the less rigid version of hero's journey is called Dan Harmon's story circle. It's also called the plot embryo method. Brandon didn't get into this too much, so we're going to take a second and just go through it. It's basically 8 steps, and it does follow the hero's journey, but it is much more simplified. So the 8 steps are: a character, is in a zone of comfort. Need, but they want something. Go, they enter an unfamiliar situation. Search, they adapt to that situation. Find, they get what they wanted. Take, they pay a heavy price for it. Return, they return to their familiar situation. Change, having changed. So those are these 8 steps. I found a video where Dan Harmon does a breakdown of this for one of the episodes of Rick and Morty, I think it is. So I will link that below as well. I also tried the plot embryo method for my story way 2 years ago or something, and found it, super useful and helpful. So I'll plot that kind of vlog there as well. But it's the idea that you're doing the same thing, the same overarching thing as the hero's journey, where you have a person who's in stasis. They get into a situation that forces them to change, and then they come home, so you can see that change. Basically, you can think of it as I was unable to do this at the start of the story in this point, and then by the end I can do it now. And even if they're not actually returning home, they're returning to a challenge that we've seen before, so we can see what they've learned and that they are now very good at this. So those were, oh my god, six plot structures that we went through extremely quickly. The last one is what he calls the plot structure method. I've also heard him call this plot archetypes in a different lecture, which I will link again, that below too. This is the idea that you dive into a well-known type of plot or plot archetype. So the types of heist, he says, or the types of performance stories, where is it an underdog story? Is it there's a losing team and a winning coach comes in to make them work story? Is it that is the Pitch Perfect and Way of Kings plot archetype one? Is it a Revenge of the Father one, like Hamlet, like The Lion King, like Dune? And you dive into it, read a whole bunch of them or watch a whole bunch of them, learn about it, think about it, learn why people like it, and then execute it in a new and different situation, in a new and different way. And this I feel like we could talk about for literal ever, because it's such a good way to write a good plot, I think. It's not about being original, it's about putting spins on things that already exist, and especially when we're newer or we're trying to tackle something that's really hard, going off of an archetype, a scaffolding that is very, very specific, more specific than the 3-act structure. These things can all work together, but more like it's almost kind of potential arcs of change. So you have a losing team at the beginning and a winning team at the end, or you have things like that. Just things that readers will find familiar, that they can latch onto, that you can then learn and innovate on in small ways to make your story better. And you can use multiples of these structures together, which is what, again, another place of innovation is combining a bunch of different structures together in one. So that is the end of my recap. I love to do a good quote at the end, and my favorite from this lecture was, events don't make a story. Struggle and what the characters go through emotionally, that's what makes a story. Therefore, you can use obstacles and struggle and stuff to connect to your character arc. The obstacles have a purpose for the character's arc and the character's emotion. They reinforce something that's been learned, or they show failure. Such good stuff to remember. I'm so excited for the next lecture and to watch it together. Let me know your favorite notes below, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you like talking about writing, you can subscribe, and I will see you next time.